It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sofia Johan to the Virtual Summer School in Entrepreneurship Research. Dr. Johan is Associate Professor at Florida Atlantic University. She has a PhD from University of Tilburg, Center for Business Law in the Netherlands. We have several people from Europe in our virtual summer school. She has expertise in entrepreneurial finance, legal, ethical issues, and financial markets. And that's the topic for today, entrepreneurship and finance. And she serves on the executive committee of the Entrepreneurship Division of Academy of Management. Thank you, Sofia, for taking the time to visit with us today.
No, thanks, Vishal, for inviting me.
So Sofia, we'll start with our first question. That's sort of a background question. How did you decide to be an entrepreneurship scholar? I'm assuming you didn't grow up saying, I'm going to be an entrepreneurship scholar.
No, I didn't grow up wanting to be an academic. I hated my professors in school. They basically caused me lots of sleepless nights. So I absolutely did not imagine going into academia. It sort of started because I decided to take a break. I was in the financial industry. I'm legally trained, as you can tell. I did my law degrees in England. I did my LLB in Liverpool, and then I did my master's in law in Warwick University. I went back to Malaysia. I'm originally Malaysian. I went back to Malaysia to work in the derivatives industry because I realized finance people get paid way more money than lawyers. And then I decided to take a break. I worked for a government venture capital fund. And as you can imagine, in a developing country like Malaysia, it was very political. So it was getting it got a bit tiring. And, the lack of sleep and whatnot, I've realized over time that I really, really value sleep. I really do. So academics was perfect for me. And so I did my PhD in law because that was my background. And I sort of went into law and finance because I had data on venture capital. Working in a venture capital fund in Malaysia, I knew the industry. I knew, and I was lucky because I was able to use what I knew and what I worked on in my academic research. And so I started doing venture capital research when it was still pretty unacceptable in finance. So a lot of the finance academics weren't naturally very keen on venture capital because they didn't consider that as real finance, not the banking, not the markets, it's not macro, it's not micro, it's basically, it was in no man's land. And so I then but then I was able to break into the finance journals. And mainly because I also had unique data. So I hand collected data for my PhD. What I did was I looked at venture capital contracts and how it affected venture capital markets in Europe, especially the Netherlands. And then so when I started work and I taught corporate finance in Toronto, I started doing sort of more research on alternative investments, which is it went from venture capital, and I applied what I learned in venture capital, the measures of success, and the financial intermediation in venture capital. I applied that to hedge funds. And then also because I worked for a venture capital fund owned by the Malaysian government, and which is also sort of a sovereign wealth fund, I went to do research on sovereign wealth funds. So I basically, it's path dependent in a way. I applied what I knew from financial intermediation into alternative investments. And then that sort of led, when you go into venture capital hedge funds, then you're looking at private companies. That's when you go into entrepreneurial finance, because entrepreneurial finance is more early stage. So a lot of people think entrepreneurial finance is for startups. Not necessarily so. It's basically researching companies, entrepreneurs, and their businesses as they go up to the IPO level, to the IPO status. So because venture capital is investments in private companies, that's sort of how I started going into entrepreneurial finance. And that's hedge funds and venture capital. And then fintech came up. So suddenly there was online financial intermediation. So I was sort of in the area at the right time where I could apply what I knew about the traditional venture capital, the traditional venture leasing, traditional hedge fund, mutual fund industry onto those companies or those businesses that went online. So that's how, for the last few years, I've been very heavily involved in fintech, which is equity crowdfunding. So it's very much like venture capitalists, but imagine if you're the venture capitalist now, you decide how to invest in young startup companies. And that's how I got into entrepreneurial finance. And to be honest, it's also because when the entrepreneurship journals started becoming more established, they became the FT. When you have entrepreneurship journals in the FT list, and for most business schools, that's the holy grail. Your whole life is about hitting the FT journals. And it's very, very hard, especially because for finance, you've got the top academics in Ivy League schools going for these FT journals. So entrepreneurship was a bit of a mix, because you had to know a bit more theory. In finance, there's no theory. It's agency theory, signaling theory. That's it, right? That's it. That's, cite a few papers on theories and that's it. Whereas you don't have to have a story. It's very much, this is the dependent variable. These are the control variables. Run a couple of regressions. Bob's your uncle. There's your paper. Whereas in entrepreneurship and management, you have to have a theory. You have to extend the theory. You have to have an interesting story. You have to catch your reader. And that's hard. And so that's how sort of, when I say I got into entrepreneurship, it was a bit of luck. It was a bit of, my area of research could be applied to entrepreneurial companies as I do corporate finance. But would I say, am I a pure entrepreneurship scholar? No, I'm not. Am I a management scholar? No, I'm not. Am I a finance scholar? No, I'm not. I'm a bit of everything. I see my work as a portfolio. The problem with publishing today, it's very difficult to hit the top journals. It's very difficult. The rejection rates for even ABS3, ABS2 journals are phenomenal, and it's increasing every year. And there are more academics coming into the field, and very few of them die because we don't really do anything except sit around all day. So and we don't earn enough to retire when we're 35. So we're in that that bad spot. So I would say, entrepreneurial finance is a great area to be in. Entrepreneurship is a great area to be in because it's such a wide area. You're doing behavioral science, you're doing empirical studies, you're doing theory, you're working on theory. But at the end of the day, you basically have to go where your research leads you, because every year your performance measures based on which journal you're in and which journals you get in. And for many universities, like for my university, we're looking at about 3 ABS3s a year. So if you're only sticking to 3 or 4 journals, you're going to have a lot of problems unless you are super brilliant.
Okay. And you bring up a good thing, Sofia, an interesting thing that I had not thought about before, which is every year there's more and more entry of scholars into the publishing game or the publishing sort of competition, but the exit is very less.
Yes.
And I had not thought about that, but now that you say it, it makes sense.
Don't you go to conferences and you see these people, there's 85-year-olds walking around.
Yeah.
We're going to be there until we're 85. I mean, I've never thought of retiring. I will retire the day I die in my office, and they'll find me 3 months later or something, when I miss a class. That's when they know I'm dead. So yeah, so there are more papers with access to data, with AI, with more intelligent people entering the field. It is very, very competitive, extremely competitive.
And Sofia, I'm going to take you back a little bit. I want people to sort of hear a little bit about your life growing up. I know you said, you hated the teachers and you didn't want to be a teacher, but tell the audience a little bit about your life growing up. What shaped you?
So I grew up in Malaysia. My parents, my mother was a government officer. My dad worked in oil, Exxon. I grew up very privileged. We had drivers. I didn't even know you paid electricity. It was just occurred to me, and I never handled money. I never had to eat alone until my parents just said, and in our family, it was very much, okay, you turn 18, you go to England, just this is your plane ticket, and there you go overseas. And, but my parents are very good in the sense that they gave us our education, but we had to support ourselves after. So we were not entitled to anything, especially I'm a girl, my brother gets everything. So it was very much you're born and bred to marry well, or you do well yourself. And I decided marrying well was not my thing. And what shaped me was I knew I had to make my own money to support the lifestyle that I was used to. So I studied very hard. And I don't know whether if you're Asian, you feel failure is not an option, right? So when we say that, I mean, this is no such thing as, oh, you can always become an entrepreneur, which again, in hindsight, that's a good idea. But for my children, if they don't pass, it's okay, we'll figure something out. No, my parents are very much, if you fail, you die, right? So it's always, academics has always been a way out of, not necessarily for me, a way out of poverty, but it's a way to maintain what I liked, which was, basically living a comfortable life. And I think it was more so what shaped me was in academics, the academic perspective is at work, where I was drafting contracts and I was working with my investee companies and entrepreneurs, and we were basically screwing them, right? So we basically wanted to suck the blood dry out of them, and I did this for years. And after a while, you're thinking, what is the point of my life other than to make money for this company that, and I don't know whether you've quit companies, you think that the company is going to fail when you leave it, and then you pack your car and you go off and nobody talks to you again. Nobody cares. You were nothing. You spent, like, I would work not 9 to 5, 5 to 9. I would be in the office. I'd be at the gym at 5, be in the office by 7. I would leave at 9, sometimes 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. And I gave it my life. And then I realized, wait a minute, when you quit, nobody's coming to you and saying, oh, you were the lifeblood of the company. But then that's when I realized I wanted to sit back and think about what I did on a daily basis at work. And that's how I did research on venture capital contracting and how it affected the performance of companies. So that's how I was very, very lucky. I was very lucky that I was able to do that. But I think also one of the things I realized, being a female from an Asian country, working in Europe and now working in the US, you have to work double hard because they don't expect a lot from you. And I think they don't expect anything interesting for you in that sense. So to a certain extent, I had to work extra hard to do what other people did. And I think it's also now trying to maneuver, because you don't go the traditional route. I didn't go through the traditional Ivy League where you get a good PhD program. I went from a law school in Tilburg to try to publish finance papers. And that took a lot of convincing, and it takes a lot of networking, like being there for people at the outset. And so I think in a way that sort of shaped me, where every morning I try to figure out what I can do to maintain what you have. I think the more you have, the harder it is to maintain. But and also because when you are working in the journals or you're working in academia in North America and in Europe, the rest of the world, they don't count. Nobody cares. Like if you are trying to publish a paper on donation-based crowdfunding in Africa, nobody cares. So you've got to figure out how to make it palatable. So when I say it shapes me in the sense that I understand where I'm coming from, which is at a disadvantage, and I have to work double hard to keep up with the rest who are privileged in other ways. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think its resilience is important. And I think it's also being open to any opportunity that you get. So, when somebody says, would you like to work in Florida? Okay, fine. Never been to the state, have no idea what it's like, but really, what can go wrong? When you, I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't like something, you can always change it. And I've always found ways to adapt and move ahead. So it's always moving forward and adapting. So don't overthink it. I have PhD students who overthink two positions. Should I go to Houston? Should I go to Washington? It's like, who cares? Choose one that gives you research funding. And then if you don't like it, you move. Like, it's not life or death. This is your first job, your first step. It's the paper. They're worried about submitting. Who cares? Worst case scenario, they reject you, you move on. you admit it. So don't overthink things. But I think coming from and being female, coming from an Asian country, I mean, I was at a conference the other day in Toronto. I think there were 50 people there. There were 2 women, and I was the only token Asian. So, and that's normal for me. It's absolutely normal. So, but you just have to, you're there, you are there, you are, you know, you're there for neurodiversity. You're there because you deserve it, but don't, you know, don't take it personal when you know you get strange looks or you get strange comments. You know, I get comments like, oh, how is it like leaving your leaving your children with your husband? So my husband's not an idiot. I mean, we both became parents at the same time. So it's because I'm female, I'm supposed to be more worried. I mean, like we literally became parents at the same second. Like he's not more experienced. So I get comments like that all the time. And it is what it is.
And Sophia, I don't want you to be distracted by everything in the chat box, but people are loving your candidness and your honesty. And just so they know, I know you said, you know, being married well was not an option, but just so people know, Sophia and Doug Cumming are both happily married couple, and she married well and he married well. So, you know, when she says being married well was not an option, she sort of exaggerated it.
I would call it, you know, I don't know whether you've heard this term, selective mating, right? So I was a PhD student, and really, as you know, PhD students don't really get to meet a lot of people. You either meet other PhD students or other academics. And I think it was very much, I met Doug when we were in Cambridge together. We were doing the same research. And that's how we met, and that's how we discussed. We're lucky. All our friends wonder how we spend so much time together. We work from home a lot. We travel together to conferences. We do the same work. And the problem is you cannot steal ideas. So every time somebody comes up with a great idea for a paper, so people wonder why we co-author a lot. It's because when we discuss it over a glass of wine, then it's very hard to steal ideas. So because he's at home with you. So we come up with a lot of fun ideas. And I think in academics, because it is such a lonely profession, it's a very selfish profession. I mean, think about it. You do the work that you want to do, you get the data that you want to do, and you teach a few hours a week. You don't see anyone. You're alone in your office. It's a very selfish profession. And also because understanding in academics, when you're a PhD student, everybody thinks you're going to work in the area that you're in. No, you could be moving countries. So you have to have the kind of partner that understands the sacrifice. And I think, so it's not just marrying well, but it's choosing someone that understands what it's like to be an academic. You are thinking about your work 24/7. There is no 9 to 5. If you know, when you go watch a movie, you're guilty because your co-author is texting you or emailing you, trying to figure out whether you've done the draft. When you could get more data, you could be networking more. So it's a 24, and you know, my children realize it's 24/7. They travel with us. They stuck in hotel rooms, babysitters and whatnot. But that's how we make money. I mean, that's at the end. Academics is at the end of the day, it's a business. I mean, you do what you love, but it is a business. It's how you make money until, again, as you die in your office and a student will call admin to get you. Well, that has actually happened in my university. I'm not kidding.
On that note, let's change tracks a little bit and sort of talk about entrepreneurial finance research. You briefly hinted at how competitive it is and people from big schools, but what do you see as sort of the past, present, and future? I know you talked about fintech, but could you maybe talk to this audience about some problems and opportunities with finance ENT research?
I think with entrepreneurial finance, you have to understand this is an area where you've got management academics who have finance data, entrepreneurship academics who have data on financial performance, and finance academics who have data on early stage or companies up to IPO. So it's very data driven, but it's also a field where you've got multiple cross-disciplinary areas coming in at a confluence. And they're all trying to I suppose publish in entrepreneurship journals and do entrepreneurial finance research, because it's quite easy. It's easy if you have the data. So there's two things about that. So now it's access to data, and And what's beautiful about entrepreneurial finance now is because data is easily accessible. You can get it from crowdfunding websites. Everything's online. You can scrape it, you can buy it. It used to be when we did work on entrepreneurial finance, you had to buy venture capital data. PitchBook, we have the data set for PitchBook. It is $60,000 a year. It is very difficult. It is very expensive. Not all universities will have access to private company data. And that's where entrepreneurial finance comes in. You've got data on public companies. So for my PhD students, I always work on, let's say, IPO. So at least you get the initial IPO 3-4 years. So you get the data public from CRISP and all that. You get all the data. But for private company data, venture experts and all that, it's very, very expensive. Orbis is 60. I mean, PitchBook and an Orbis, yeah, so it's extremely expensive. But now it's quite easy to get data on firm performance, investment performance, on sort of what the equity is being provided by companies. And when I say entrepreneurial finance, you have to remember it's the breadth of finance. You're looking at investor behavior. The paper I did on employee welfare, I'm looking at employee behavior, and employee actions that relate to firm behavior. Then you're looking at you're looking at firm performance based on investor behavior. So there's so many areas that touch upon entrepreneurial finance, but the problem is you have to work with data, and more importantly, you have to work with empirical analysis. So that those students who are only working on theory, it's going to be very difficult, because it's very difficult now to work within entrepreneurial finance without having some sort of empirical analysis, because you've got your reviewers. You have to understand how this works. So when we say the area, your research is nothing. So if a bear shits in the woods, who cares, right? Your research is nothing until you publish. So when we talk about publishing, you do your research and it's great. Then it goes to you find a journal. People try to hit the top journals, and then you work your way down. And then it goes to an editor. The editor just rejects because it's not what they want to publish, or they accept it. And it goes to 2 or 3 reviewers. So in entrepreneurial finance, that could be a management scholar, entrepreneurship scholar. It could be a finance scholar. The finance scholar will hate the paper if it's not empirically robust. The management scholar will hate the paper because it doesn't have a lot of extension of theory. The entrepreneurship scholar will hate it because it doesn't really deal with young startup companies and entrepreneurship theory. So that's the biggest hurdle. So when we say how challenging it is, it's because now there are more academics with different backgrounds and different disciplines coming in to determine whether your paper gets through, right? So if you are purely management, purely entrepreneurship, and purely finance, it's very difficult to get published. You have to have a bit of everything. So that's why the co-authorship comes in. So you've got some people who are very strong in getting the data. I work with co-authors who are brilliant at Python. I'm trying to find co-authors who can use AI to create code to get data, right? So right now, you don't have to be a computer programmer. You can find an AI app that will create a code to get data for you. There are open apps. So I just got a code from Paul Momtaz, who does work in crypto and also cryptocurrencies and also fintech. So he has an open source software so that we can do text analysis. So this is all. So you're trying to get data that's not secondary data in a way, but it's also unique data, because you are as good as your data. And when I harp on data for entrepreneurial finance, especially for those that are more entrepreneurship and management based, the problem here is that you have finance scholars who deal with millions of data points, right? So when we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years of financial data. And so when you say, well, I have information on 10 companies in 2 countries, you already know that that's dead in the water. So there's 2 things to think about. There is the area of research that you find it interesting to write the paper. That's 10% of the way. 90% of the way is understanding how to get it published. And that's where the challenge comes in, right? That's where you have to understand why data is important, and why getting unique data or getting the right data, the right measures, and then using the right methodologies is important. But at the same time, what we always forget is the story has to be interesting. And when I say this with entrepreneurial finance, people will say, "Oh, there's a gap in the literature because there isn't information. There isn't a lot of papers on equity crowdfunding in Ghana." They're like, "Well, you see, you think there is nothing on Google Scholar. The problem is that the 100 papers that have gone through the system have all been rejected." So just because there's a gap in the literature doesn't mean that it hasn't been, no one's tried to breach that. It's just, so you have to be very careful. The story has to be interesting, and it's got to be something that is 5 years ahead, because if you come up with an interesting topic today, it's going to get published in 2 to 3 years at the very best, right? If you're not in a special issue, if you don't have the right contacts, you're looking at 2 to 3 years. I've had a paper that took 7 years, right? So by the time it comes out, this is when my investment banker friends will say, "You guys are so outdated. Like you're researching old things." You're like, "No, I researched it 7 years ago. By the time it gets published, it's already non-existent," right? So that's why. So entrepreneurial finance today it's competitive. It is very data driven, but you're lucky because data is quite easy to get. You can get the data. You can get sufficient levels of good data that's reliable by getting it online or sourcing it yourself, right? So and that's a cheap way to do it. The expensive way is buying the data sets. And the universities generally, if you do entrepreneurial finance, unless you join a university or a school that deals with entrepreneurship, or that's a very strong entrepreneurship program and maybe a strong finance program, they're not going to buy you the data sets, right? Because it's they don't see it as that important. But having said that, when we think about when it does get published, it probably has bigger bang for the buck than any other type of research to me, because it helps young companies, it helps entrepreneurs. So that last policy recommendation that you have in the last paragraph, it really does make a difference. And I use my papers to teach my MBA students, because they're not just learning from a paper that they've read 15, 20 years ago, but really this is what research we're doing now, right?
So when you are a reviewer, or when you are sort of on the other side, when your PhD students or junior scholars send you papers to give feedback, what do you look for in a paper? What makes you think, yeah, this paper has potential?
The first thing I do is I Google Scholar it. Every time I get a paper, as a referee, as an editor, as I get papers from students, and they come up with projects for their seminars, I Google Scholar it, because to see whether there's any overlap. And even if there's something similar from another country, that's out. Like it's already been published. Every reviewer in the world is doing the same thing. The minute they find an excuse to reject the paper, then you've got a problem. So the first thing is I look at interest, whether the topic is interesting or whether the idea is interesting. And then I look at rigor. And some editors will say this, well, they'll do it, and some reviewers will tell you this, they look at the bibliography first to see whether they were cited. If they weren't cited, then there's no point accepting this paper. Citations, the thing is, you're at this stage where it's not that important, but at the senior scholar stage, citations is probably more important than paper count, because that's how you get to the next level. So, when I look at the measures of outcome versus the variables, and I look at the mechanism now. So is there a connection? But it's a story sometimes. I mean, sometimes you get bored of reading the same, project A is successful. These are the measures because of some sort of either social welfare program or some sort of random variable that they've chosen. It's not as interesting enough. So it's coming up with a story that's interesting and credible. And what is the test factor for interesting? I don't know. Sometimes you just read the abstract. The abstract is very important. You have to be, the abstract is, I spend more time on the abstract than the actual paper sometimes because that will get you. But, empiric, sometimes, the dependent variables, are not perfect. The controls aren't perfect, but if that's the best you can do, I'm okay with that. But it's just an interesting story. That's what I like.
Okay. And before we open it up to the participants for questions, can you tell us about one finance entrepreneurship paper that you are working on these days? How did you come up with the idea? How did you put together the team? How do you decide which journal to target?
Okay, so today I'm working on 2 papers, just today. So after this, I'll be working on 2 papers. I have one that is on social entrepreneurship, donations-based crowdfunding. So this is a paper that I worked on with, I don't work with people I don't know. Generally, I work with people I do know. I'm not, as long as one on the team is someone I know, and then, so you build that team that way. So this is from someone, this is from Ilna, this is a paper that I'm working on with Jung Xia, which is a professor at Aberdeen. And I was a visiting professor at Aberdeen I was a chair of entrepreneurial finance at Aberdeen for about 3 years. So I was brought in to help the PhD students and help and sort of work with my colleagues. And I'm no longer a visiting professor, but I still have the residuals. So one of the PhD students worked on Islamic crowdfunding. So he had data, he collected data on Islamic crowdfunding. And so we're sort of we have one other paper on that, which was went to, I think, an ABS3 journal on Islamic crowdfunding. But the problem here is that there's a limit to what you can do with Islamic crowdfunding. Nobody's interested in Islamic finance, Islamic crowdfunding. So my job was to sort of reframe it. So we decided to look at social entrepreneurship, because in crowdfunding, there's not a lot on donations-based crowdfunding. There's a lot of work on equity crowdfunding, which is my area of research, rewards-based, but not a lot on donations-based. So I wanted to understand whether if you have an investor looking at on a donations-based crowdfunding website, but there are projects that are both commercial and purely philanthropic. And we have this theory about philanthropy, how people donate for philanthropic reasons because it's a feel-good factor, the warm glow. So we wanted to see whether this extends towards donations-based crowdfunding when you are faced with both commercial and social, because a lot of the research papers look at just the monetary rewards or the monetary rewards that you get from rewards-based and equity crowdfunding. So that's one reason, right? And then, so that's one paper. We're doing the final touch-up for that. And that was initially aimed for a finance journal, but we decided that we could aim higher, so we're going for an entrepreneurship journal. That's the whole reframing to social entrepreneurship. And moving it away from Islamic crowdfunding to donations-based crowdfunding on an Islamic portal where everybody shares the same values, right? So that's one. I have another one, which I'm working with with someone I met at Academy of Management 2 years ago. I like to meet people at conferences, because then if they backstab me, I can recognize them later and I can strangle them at another conference. So if they find dead bodies everywhere, that's me, right? Again, working with people you don't really know, there's the higher risk of being backstabbed, but that's why I like to see their faces. And so I'm working with him on a paper which he's getting data from a couple of Chinese PhD students. I like to work with PhD students because I think that they need the extra help to get to the next level. So we're working on the application of fintech and greenwashing. So I also do ESG work. I sort of fall into these areas. So and what we want to see is, if a company implements fintech, and not a fintech company, we're not talking about banking company, we're talking about a company that implements payment systems like PayPal and AI and sort of real fintech, blockchain technology into their operations, how would that affect greenwashing? And why we're looking at greenwashing is because in China, they disclose any greenwashing activities by companies per year. So there are 37 counts of greenwashing. Tesla is a huge breacher. So China has this, they disclose it publicly, the companies that have any environmental sanctions made against them. So, and that's interesting because they don't do it in a lot of other countries. And for fintech, but with the problem with fintech is that there's no database for that. So the PhD students are working on scraping the websites, every website of every company, to determine and make a count. We're creating an index to count how much fintech is being applied in their operations. And of course, so you've got fintech, application of fintech, and then you've got the greenwashing. So then we're trying to figure out what is the mechanism. So how would fintech affect greenwashing? So that's something in finance, nobody really cares about the mechanism, but increasingly that's more important. And in entrepreneurial finance, especially, it's more important. So what we're identifying is that there are two ways to do this. So when you apply fintech, it just means that there's less managerial, there's arbitrariness. So because there's so much information, managers cannot play dumb. So managers have to abide by certain codes of conduct, and so that will, I suppose, it will mitigate greenwashing because managers aren't allowed to do certain things. Greenwashing isn't a choice, right? It's a managerial choice to carry out greenwashing. For those of you who are not familiar with greenwashing is when a company pretends to be environmentally or socially friendly, but it's not really. Our example is, you know, when you go to a hotel and they say, if you hang up your towel, you're really saving the environment. And of course, all of you do it. I never do. I put it on the ground. You wash it for me every day because I'm paying for you to wash my towel every day, right? But then they save money, but it looks like they're environmentally friendly, but they're not. And then so that's what we're looking at, just the mechanism. And that again is working with a co-author that I know, and I was also visiting professor at a Chinese chemical engineering university. So I know some of these PhD students, and that's why I work with them. I have another paper I'm working on with a PhD student at FAU, and we're looking at we just submitted it last night. So we're looking at how, very short paper. We're looking at how ownership structures for crowdfunding websites. So crowdfunding websites, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, whatnot, they sometimes take ownership of companies that are on their portal, which is a huge conflict of interest, right? Because you're more likely to, it's like Netflix, are more likely to advertise their shows, which they produce, instead of other shows that they don't produce, because they have been incented to do that. So that one, we're looking at how the actual ownership may be, and how it affects companies may be measured wrongly by other papers. So and the reason why we do this is because we included it in another paper, but the reviewer said, you don't need that, get rid of it, but we already have that work. So we thought, okay, let's just put it in a journal where the PhD student can get at least one publication before he graduates, and we're just trying to get it out quickly because we already have you carve it out. So that's what we're doing. How do I meet my co-authors? It's either through sometimes when you're invited to discuss a paper, be very constructive, because then people either in the audience or the authors themselves sort of realize, hey, wait a minute, this is a great person, that they're helpful, they're smart. Maybe we can invite them on the paper later, right? So because you always need help, especially for me, like I sometimes I don't have time to get the data. I like to get the data, and then I can work on the other part, or I work on the methodology, and then someone will work on the theoretical part. So and also because I think it's not that easy now to just work alone. I find working alone really boring anyway. So I prefer to work with a few people, and you can get more work done. It's working smart. But through conferences, network, when you're discussing, discuss really well, be constructive, be kind. Even though if you think the paper's god awful, just make sure get it up to the next level where it's not that god awful, right? And then it's just be open, like it's just be open to meeting people, because then you'll come up with ideas. I have one co-author that I have a paper with. I think it was at sovereign wealth funds, where it was just discussing at one of the dinners or one of the lunches. we're just discussing something on sovereign wealth funds, and say, oh, what about this idea? What about that idea? Hey, let me email you, and there you have it. We have a paper and jibs.
Wonderful. And I have lots of follow-up questions, but I'll hold off on them because I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. Seema, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for all of this information, like hundreds of sessions at one session. My question is, you mentioned in your research about quality review versus outstanding equity. You said about the investors' behavior. You said they don't blindly accept the qualitative information, and they also not into so much the excessiveness of promotional language. So does it fly on the research? Well, like sometimes we see a research that's somehow or some kind of promotional research and lacks the ideas, solid ideas. Also, what makes investor like the recipe of the investor behavior that makes the sophisticated investor invest in a new project or a new idea. One question. So if I have time rather than that, I can ask my second.
Seema, hold off, because we need to also let her answer and give other people a chance to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so no worries. So, to start off, the problem with entrepreneurial finance research, it moves so quickly. So when you read a paper, like for example, if you read a paper on crowdfunding that was published in 2015, remember crowdfunding in the US has changed significantly. It started in 2016. And then it's now, so now in crowdfunding in the US, it used to be you can raise up to $1 million a year. Now it's $5 million a year. So it is increasingly becoming a source of corporate finance in a way, right? So when we talk about investor behavior, research methodologies has also moved rather quickly. So it used to be where you carry out surveys, right? The problem with surveys are flawed, and you'd have to have multiple. When I did my PhD, I could get away with 50 survey respondents, right? Now, very hard, unless you've got really deep data. More importantly, like we talk about investor behavior, what they're doing now is there's investor behavior labs where they do eye tracking. So if you are looking at a website, you're trying to buy, you're trying to buy products, or you're trying to invest in a company, they can track your eye to see whether they're looking at financial information or qualitative information, or there's research on how good looking the entrepreneurs are, and that makes a difference. So it's when we talk about investor behavior, the problem now is that the qualitative information is insufficient because there are lots of other research money being spent on getting hard data on whether the investor choices. My daughter's high school has a CAT scan. So the school has a CAT scan where some of the scientists on behavioral scientists are basically giving, letting the people, the test subjects look at pictures or and then they look at brain technology. So I'm not saying qualitative information isn't important, but the research out there now, the research is so far advanced that it's they want more robust analysis. And unfortunately, that means that it's data. And unfortunately, that means that more data is coming out. So you have to be very careful. So whenever, like if you read a paper, you have to imagine, say the whole, the whole idea of foundational papers, when it comes to entrepreneurial finance, other than a few, it's moving so quickly that it's very hard to appreciate. And I say this again because I see a lot of papers that don't get published, right? So of the 20% of papers that do get published, I see the 80% that don't get published. And this is where the reviewers will come in and say, we don't buy that, it's not proven, we don't buy the methodology. So many areas of so many questions about these papers. It's not that you can't get away with it if you have it if it's a strong enough analysis. But there's a lot of work on investor behavior where people are sort of looking at, just as there's increasing work on employee behavior and just sort of other than the entrepreneur. So we're talking about entrepreneurial finance. They're looking at sort of the ecosystem around the entrepreneur, right? So how that affects, these are it used to be missing variables. It used to be the endogeneity aspect, where there could be other variables that may affect the performance of a company. So everybody's going around like crazy trying to get those missing measures of performance in a way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sophia. We'll go to Rudo now. Rudo, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for Sophia for that amazing presentation. I really enjoyed the real talk. Yes, so my question goes to one of the aspects that you mentioned, that us as scholars, we need to think ahead because the papers that we produce might not be published for the moment, but maybe in 2 years or 3, 4, 5 years. But at the same time, you know, the community is so dynamic. So which strategies are you using to ensure that all the papers that you are researching have kind of a proactive, a forecastation of what's coming up?
If it's data, we always have to be prepared to have to collect data by the second round of review. So we have to be prepared to collect more data. And so this is why sometimes when you purchase data sets, like we use PitchBook, we only have it up to 2018 or 2020. Anything above that, we can't use. So then we have to do work that sort of relate to why the data stops at 2020, right? So we sell the paper in that way. But so it's very hard to overcome that. And sometimes you can tell the reviewers or the editors, unfortunately, this is the data that we have up to this certain point, but it's still relevant to the analysis that we're carrying out. But in other cases, we make sure that we can always go back and get more data, because sometimes, and you're going to need to collect the data in 3 months or whatever, right? So if they need to ask us to get more data, you get it. Or more, what we generally try to do is that the reason why we're measuring at this point is because of various policy reasons, or because this is sufficient for us to measure up to this point. You can sell it at that. But it's very hard. That's a problem with working with data. It's just that it got to a certain point, and you have to get it published as quickly as possible. That's why choosing the right journal. Sometimes is it worth it to go through the top 3, take a year to do that, and then go down, or where your data gets older? And admittedly, I do have a paper that is, the data is so old, nobody wants to work on it anymore. It's going to a book chapter, right? So but we can't kill it. There's no way you want to kill it, but there are a few that there's no way we can overcome it. You try to look forward. So that's why the story or the question, I always call it a story, because I always think of it as a full story, you know, introduction, the middle part, the boring, the plot, and then the conclusion. But it's just, it should be a question that will continue to be asked in the future, but yet it's being answered by you at this point in time. The scenario might change in the future, then that will just be up to future research. For example, I was just writing a letter today or last night about somebody said, well, the reviewer said dependent variable isn't great. I don't like it. So we have to explain that the reason why we're using this dependent variable, this is what's available. We understand there are other ways to measure the performance, but at this point in time, there is no other way. So it is up to the future researchers to find better measures. But at this point, based on these 3 papers, this is the best that we can do. Unfortunately, that's all we can do.
Wonderful. Patricia, you want to go next? Patricia, we cannot hear you. We'll move to the next person then. Patricia, can you fix your microphone? We cannot hear you. We'll move to the next person, and you can come back and ask your question once the microphone is working. Fernando, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sophia, for the presentation. Good to see you again virtually. Sophia, I'm on that stage of trying to choose a dissertation topic. And one of the topics that I'm really interested in, and you briefly mentioned this in your presentation. It's the idea of the politicization of the business firm, and how some tendencies around like the appealing to DEI, to ESG, to greenwashing, just like you said, affects not only the structure of the firms, but the source of income of the firms as well. So there are a lot of examples, especially in the outsourcing literature, that some firms that they use these outsourcing mechanisms, first of all, to make things cheaper, but at the same time, depending on the firms that are on this outsourcing structure, they can be more or less prone to these ESG and DEI approaches. Therefore, they hurt the overall performance of the firm. I would like to know if there's some recent literature that you are aware of that studies specifically this appealing to these tendencies worldwide, and that had mixed results in the performance measures of the firms, outsourced firms and non-outsourced firms.
So you're looking at, so the issue there is you're doing with politicization, right? So there's a lot of literature out there on the political backgrounds of CEOs, the political backgrounds of employees, the demographic, the jurisdiction, political jurisdiction of firms. So you'd have to figure out whether you're using the same measures of politicization, or whether it's an international, if it's an international paper versus a multi-jurisdictional versus a US paper, then you have to get data on that. So there's a lot of people on that, but there's not much that I know about outsourcing. So it's interesting that the outsourcing may not be as heavily researched, but mainly because it's very difficult to find data on companies that do outsourcing, because then unless you have the data source, you would have to basically hand collect, right? Are we still online?
Yeah, we
can
hear you.
Yeah. Okay, so you would have to hand collect. And I think that is where the strength lies, the interest in that. There's not a lot out that if you get data on the outsourcing, then the politicization is easy to measure. ESG will be a different issue, because we know now the ESG literature is in shambles, because none of the measures of ESG are correlated, right? So there's no real specific good measure for ESG. There's a lot of research on how ESG measures are difficult to follow. So once you put that package together, I think it'd be interesting. But the issue there would be mechanism, right? So that's probably one reason why there aren't a lot of papers on this topic, because to get data on outsourcing, to get data on firm operations, especially if it's private versus public information, but the mechanism is why would a company's political affiliation or employee or management or board or CEO affiliation affect the outsourcing, and then how the ESG works within that. So I mean, if you can get that right, I think it'd be fairly interesting. But then you'd have to figure out, you're looking at about 2 papers out of that. So you'd want to not spend. You've got to probably stress on the outsourcing aspect of that research, because that's probably where you can get a couple of papers carved out instead of just the ESG and the politics. Because the politics would be one paper, the ESG be one paper. So, and then the outsourcing would be interesting.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Sophia. Kanan, you're next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vishal, and thank you so much, Dr. Sophia. I'm working on a paper on funder or investor identity. So, like, we are trying to use the theories on entrepreneurial identity and use it for to see how the identities of investors actually affect their investment behaviors. The challenge that we are facing is that we are trying to manipulate the identities through experiments. But in order to extend that ecological validity of our findings, I think it's very important also to have a field study, to have some real life data. And we're not quite sure how can we get that uh, real life data of real investors and their real identities. So is there something that you can suggest in this regard? How can we conduct a field study with regard to the funder or investor identities to see how these identities affect their investment behaviors?
Oh yeah, I mean that's the holy grail, right? Trying to find more about the investors. We get a lot of information on the output, so investor amounts, countries and all that, but we don't really get investor identity. So that would be, if you get it, that would be huge interest. Field study. The problem here is if you're working on a paper that's in certain countries, in the US, for example, and in Europe, you've got IRB. The problem is when you're working with human subjects, they seem to think that you're going to dissect them or something. Like trying to tell them it's just a survey. No, they hate that. So whatever you do, make sure that you get within IRB approval, or because some journals will not publish if you do not get IRB approval or exemption. Usually, if you're actually talking one-on-one with the person, then it's probably IRB approval. If you're doing a survey that's anonymized, it's IRB exemption, right? But you have to have verification of that, or else they will not publish the good journals, especially the amount. If you're doing a field study, the amount of work that goes into it, it's going to be, you want to get a couple of journals out of that. So journal articles. So, the field study though, what I would do is I would do the research on figuring out what are, when they say the avenues of future research, sort of figure out what type of investor behavior they want to identify, right? So investor identity. So, and then you'll be able to determine what kind of field study, whether you're doing I know of at the Academy of Management last year, there was one field study that they actually look at. I think resellers in India and Pakistan. There's a lot of investment in Pakistan and India because field studies are much easier. They go to a village and they sort of carry out experiments there. But you have to be careful because you want to know what kind of investor identity you're looking for before it's sort of reverse engineering. It's not that you carry out a field study, you find these identities. It's no, you want to identify these identities. Who do we go to? And then in the paper, you flip it the other way. You just say that you don't say it's reverse engineering, but that's what you have to do. There's huge interest. Everyone's trying to figure out investor identity, like looking at the investor. That's why entrepreneurial finance is so fun. Because when we talk about finance, nobody cares about the actual investor. It's just accredited, non-accredited. But now we're actually looking at whether they're what religion, what race. You have data on. I think there's. I was on a PhD defense last month, and he was telling me that one of the supervisors was saying he had data on managerial health, like OCD, all mental health. He had data on all that. So don't do anything on that because they already have the data. So forget that, right? Don't go anywhere near that topic. But yeah, so everybody's they're scrambling, and there's a lot of money involved in that. So you've got to find your niche. So I would do sort of I would really go into the entrepreneurial investor identity literature to figure out what exactly is missing.
And Sophia, what I understand from your answer is, yes, it's an interesting topic of research, but it's also not an easy topic of research. Yes. So keep that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So just don't try to do a field experiment and then come up with it, because then the problem will be that somebody's already identified it in another form. So just look at what's missing and then figure out how to ascertain that identity.
Wonderful. Cecilia, you want to ask your question next?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to ask my question. I am carrying out a study on a cash holding and family firm, and I noticed that context assumes importance in this field and more in general when finance enters in entrepreneurship because of the impact, for example, of regulation or bank system. So my question is, what's your advice about context in this topic? How deal with it? Because sometimes it seems like context make impossible to find valid rules to explain the phenomenon in different contexts to theorize.
Yes, it is. It is very difficult, and you know, and especially when you're talking about the research is one thing, but trying to get it published, context is extremely important because they want to understand whether the context differs to a certain extent. For example, if you're studying something in France, so what is it about France, the institutional environment? What is it about the context of you studying? What is different that, but yet also scalable? So what are your results that are, you know, that are derived from a study in France based on the institutional aspects in France, in that context, is it scalable to other countries? It's not, nobody cares whether this, you know, A happens, as a result of B in France. It's like, no, but how is that scalable? So to stress that, I think when, you know, context isn't really that hard, it's understanding how within that context, you can then apply it to other research jurisdictions, to other areas of research. So not only just geographic jurisdictions, but also to other areas of research. So for example, when I do work in venture capital, I can say this also applies to mutual funds. This also applies to hedge funds. But context is extremely important, but just because it's a unique setting doesn't mean that it's insurmountable. You can still make it interesting, but you have to say at this point in time, even at time context, it is interesting because it could apply elsewhere. When we talk about something like, we talk about research in financial crisis, right? Or COVID, but we could also apply it in the future, or we could use you could use research from the past because it will happen again, and we know it will happen again, right? My husband is going to Wuhan next week, or God knows what he's coming back with, right? No offense to anybody from Wuhan, but I'm just saying. I would in the paper or in your research address the uniqueness of the context that you're using for your research, and also the uniqueness of the institutions, but be very careful, because then you have to say, even though this is unique for this certain time period, for this institution, for this country, this will definitely apply to other countries for other time periods and whatnot. So as long as then it doesn't necessarily hinder your research in that sense.
Wonderful. Tanya, you're next.
Thank you, Professor. So I'm a first-year PhD student in the public system. So my area of specialization is public policy, and I'm studying in a management institute. So my question is, how do I adequately incorporate the public aspect and the public context in the right balance with, say, microfinance and social entrepreneurship, or say the regulatory environment of the public systems? So because then I will have management, entrepreneurship, finance, as well as public policy to incorporate. And how much scope does it actually have in terms of research impact and publications?
Well, there's two ways to think about it. You could see it is if you're in the public, so you know more about the public policies and sort of the rationale leading up to these public policies, then what you're doing is using what you know on public sector events, which result then in either new startups being created, or the failures of startups, or just the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But and then other people are doing it the other way. We're looking at sort of private investment going into entrepreneurial endeavors, and then how that could relate to future public policy. Yours would probably be, this is what's been done, right? The public sector have done this, but then looking at what the data, obviously I wouldn't say they've done a bad thing, because I've done research on bad public policies, and it never works well for you. It does. You get death threats, all sorts of things, right? It's still very relevant. But the beauty of that is that you have insight on public policy making. You probably have more insight on that. So then what you're doing is understanding how it affects the ecosystem, or it affects entrepreneurial activity, or it affects entrepreneurial performance. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, if you look at it from the whole, I suppose, the whole field of study, some are doing it from investor to company to performance. You could do it, and how the government could help. You're doing it from the government's done this, the company, this is what's happening in the company, how this is affect the retail investor. So yeah, definitely it's very difficult. I work on papers where I have to find people who are familiar with what's happening in the public policy arena, because I'm not familiar with all the codes and the new laws and whatnot, especially in different countries. So I actually guess if I'm doing work in China, then I've got to find somebody who speaks the language or who reads the language to be able to understand. And especially when you're doing empirical work, you need to know exogenous shocks, right? You need to know what's happening on a timely basis. So 100% you can incorporate that. In fact, you're looking at it from the other perspective. So, I would say your research would be, again, what could the government have done better?
And Sofia, I know we asked you for 60 minutes of your time. We are already past that. Are you willing to take a few more questions? Or
I've got nothing to do. I'm on an island in the middle of nowhere, honestly.
okay. So Mary, you are next.
Hello, Sophia, and thank you again. I'm working right now in the idea of discourse. Artificial intelligence generate discourse and how that affects the crowdfunding campaigns and the levels of investments, far more of the behavior of the investors, how that discourse that you don't know where it comes from and is almost perfect affects the level of investments. I had some kind of literature review, and I found a software called Kata that was done to measure that. But do you have some insights or something you suggest to face this experiments, their scope, including artificial intelligence? Because maybe the entrepreneurs, they won't tell you that they generate the discourse with artificial intelligence. So what do you suggest?
So you're looking at crowdfunding websites that use AI to provide advice to the investors. Is that what you're looking at, or
no? Some part of the crowdfunding campaigns is the discourse, the story that they tell us.
Yeah.
And they probably they are generated with artificial intelligence, the video, the text, all the comments, all the structure of the campaign, and how that affects the levels of investment.
Yeah.
So
I think the issue there would be, how would the investor know, right? The signaling. So you're looking at signaling.
Yes.
So it could be whether the use of AI is a bad signal for the investors to take in, because that just means that the entrepreneurs don't know how to write, or the use of AI is a good signal because that means that the entrepreneurs are using using latest technology to work smart, right? So but when it's just, first you've got to, it's a choice. The problem there is it's a choice to use the AI, right? So you've got to identify the companies that don't use AI, and then or they can choose to use AI before everybody else is using AI. So you've got that problem with just identifying the choice variable. And then you're looking at the investor behavior, how will the investors know whether it's AI or not, right? So because yes, some companies some crowdfunding websites will use AI for the discourse part. The analogy is here is when we look at corporate finance, and then we look at analysts and an analysis of the annual reports. The main comment made by referees will be, but the CEOs don't draft the reports. The annual reports are drafted by the PR companies, right? So it's to say that if the CEO doesn't really follow what the annual reports do, is it a bad thing or a good thing? But the problem is, they say, but the annual reports aren't drafted by the CEO. Right, it's drafted by some companies is drafted by the PR companies, so it doesn't really measure the managerial skill of the company, right? Because it's external. So the same thing with AI. The problem is, how are they using the AI? So that you've got to be very clear about the using of AI in the discourse by the crowdfunding. And then you've got to either look at a few crowdfunding websites, right, that do and don't, and then within the crowdfunding website, you've got to look at the companies that choose to use. I don't know whether do all the companies have access to this discourse, or is it just only a few, right? So this is how you've got to separate the samples so that you can do the robustness check. So even before you start out, just separate the samples so that you can do the difference in difference tests. You can do propensity score. You can do all of these empirical analysis, but just don't assume that it's all created equal. The question will be, which companies choose, do the crowdfunding websites force every company to have this discourse? And then that's from the crowdfunding website section, right? And then from the investor, do they rely on the discourse? And if they rely on the discourse, do they know whether it's AI generated or not, right? So once you have all of that sorted out, then it'd be much easier to do analysis step by step by step. But that would be the main criticism. And the analogy will be, you're going to get somebody who's familiar with the corporate finance literature that looks at annual reports and firm behavior. And they're going to say, well, annual reports aren't drafted by the company. Same thing here. The discourse isn't drafted by the crowdfunding. It's a technology, right? And then you got to figure out, if you've got the different platforms, which AI, ChatGPT 4 is way better than ChatGPT 5, but 3.5, Claude is great, Symposia is great, but there are others that, are not so great. So maybe you'd also have to get data on that.
We'll move to our next question, Sofia.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, Sofia. I'm a first-year PhD student trying to do some work in the intersection of information management and entrepreneurship. My question is that a lot of countries these days, I mean, they of course always had this regulatory filing of private companies, the data and the yearly financial statements at different levels. And in the last decade or so, a lot of this data has become very easy as in, of course, you have to pay. Sometimes some of it is free, but it has become easier to access at a large scale aggregated level. So my question is that, and of course, in different countries, there are different levels of disclosure. So my question is that data rich enough to come up with meaningful analysis, or has there been any past instance of some insightful research which has been carried out by analyzing the entire data set of a particular company, or even say multiple countries of a particular country, or a limited set of companies from a particular country? Has that been utilized, or is it rich enough to be utilized for some strong research?
See, once you have data, especially regulatory filings, there's going to be teams of PhD students going through that, right? But the difference is, and that there's enough data there because it's a level playing field. To say that there should be more data, everybody says this is it. We've downloaded everything onto Stata. This is it, right? So yes, it is going to be used to death, right? But a lot of them will be working in single countries. To have that ability to work cross-country or cross-regions would be a different issue altogether. And also it's just finding the right, sifting through the data, finding the right question. And I say this because one of my papers that I worked with a PhD student, which is a Journal of Business Ethics, we had data on venture capital investments, right? Pitch book. But what we found was interesting, not everybody's used this, but what we found interesting is that some venture capital companies provide different reports to different investors. So let's say a pension fund will get 3 reports a year, an endowment will get 4 reports a year, an individual investor will get 1 report a year, right? So what we discovered that, when I was a venture capitalist, I knew that this was the case, but nobody had looked at that. So we just wrote a paper on that just by that one set of that one column of data. So this is what I'm saying. If the filings are publicly available, even if they're not, everybody's scraping it anyway. It is going to be done to death. But you'd be amazed at how people cannot connect right? So they cannot connect the filings because they don't really understand the institutional aspect. So for example, a private firm may file less documents than a public firm, right? But maybe a private firm has to provide more data than a public firm. And so, what is the difference between, or what happens when a private firm publicly lists? Is the information more or less detailed? So things like those questions will arise. So yes, once the data is available, it's going to be scraped to death, but it's up to you to really go through it, understand the institutional aspects, and come up with an interesting and fun story, right? So that's where the papers get more traction.
Sophia, we have a lot of interest from people in asking you questions, including in the chat box, but I have the enviable task of bringing us to a closure. So let me ask you the last question we ask everyone, which is, what's one advice you would give to aspiring entrepreneurship scholars? I know you already said data analysis and, the bar is high and entry barriers are high, but one thing that you would want them to think about?
Be kind on your way up, because these are the same people you meet on your way down, right? In any career, in any area. So as an academic, especially, because it's always up and down. So when you meet somebody at a conference and, I used to go to a conference and nobody would want to sit next to me at a lunch. Nobody wanted to talk to me. So I would sit next to a bar with somebody random. So both of us would be like, oh, nobody wants to talk to you too. So yeah, so then they became my best co-authors because we were all losers, right? So be kind to people on your way up, whoever you meet, whether they're, sociologists, whether they're whatever area they're in, because you never know, one day you find mutual interest in an area of research. Don't exclude them because they're not beneficial to you today. When you say networking, it seems very transactional. It shouldn't be transactional. It should be very much be open, your world is very small, and just be very kind on your way. Sorry, that's my dog. So be very kind to people on your way up, because on your way down, these are the same people you're going to meet.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophia, for that. And on that note, we'll stop here. And
if there's anything, you have my email. You can email me, you can text me, you can Zoom. Like, I'm happy to help anyway. I'm happy to have Vishal. Like, he's a superstar. So I'm more than happy to have Vishal. He has another one. You and your wife, the Brangelina of of management, right?
well,
yeah. So again, please, I'm happy to chat or connect or whatever. Just, you have my email, contact me anytime.
Thank you, Sophia. And you might find some of our participants connect with you on LinkedIn.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.